This is social influence revision for paper 1. It's worth 96 marks and 2 hours. The social influence section itself is worth 24 marks and it should take you around 30 minutes. The social influence section, according to the advanced information, will include explanations for obedience, explanations of resistance to social influence, and minority influence. Please be aware that you will also need to revise research methods within this section, as research methods could be included in here. It could be using an item, it could be a data analysis question, draw a graph question, statistical test question, any kind of research methods question could come up in this section alongside these topics which have been stated in the advanced information. So please make sure you are revising research methods alongside any paper 1 revision. We will start with explanations for obedience. We have agentic state and legitimacy of authority. That is where we are going to begin. An agentic state is when you do not see yourself as responsible for your behavior. You see yourself as an agent who is carrying out a behavior on someone else's behalf. An individual will begin in an autonomous state, so you will believe that you are independent. You will then go through an agentic shift when you perceive someone as being an authority figure. So, for example, in Milgram's experiment, the participants went in being autonomous and having responsibility for their behavior. They would then sit in the room with the experimenter. If they believed that the experimenter was a legitimate authority figure, then they would start behaving as an agent for that experimenter. So like when the experimenter said, the experiment requires you to continue. I am responsible for the behavior. I'm responsible for the outcomes of this. That person would go through an agentic shift and they would believe that they are behaving as an agent. So behaving on behalf of the experimenter in Milgram's experiment. When we have a little closer look at agentic shift, Milgram said that people would stay in this agentic state due to binding factors. So these are aspects of the situation which allow the person to ignore or minimize the effect of their behavior. So already they don't feel as responsible for their behavior because they believe that they are behaving as an agent on behalf of somebody else. But to help them stay in this agentic state, they would ignore or minimize the effects of their behavior using something such as shifting the blame onto the victim. So they may say, well, he was foolish to volunteer for this experiment, and then it makes them not feel as bad when they're carrying out that behavior, and it keeps them in that agentic state. It keeps them acting on behalf of that agent. In evaluation of the agentic state, we've got research support and opposing research. So the research support comes from Milgram's study. Milgram suggested that when the participant asked the experimenter who was responsible if the learner was harmed, or Mr. Wallace, then the experimenter replied and said, I am responsible. Then the participants continued with the procedure, but they continued at a pace. So Milgram suggested that when they asked that question and the experimenter gave that reply and accepted responsibility for the outcome, then they said, oh, okay, I'm just going to act on behalf of this experimenter. And they just continued without asking too many questions, and they continued at a pace. That wasn't all of the participants, however. That was just a small minority of the participants that behaved in that way. There is some additional opposing research from Rank and Jacobson. So they found when they did a study where they asked doctors to give an order to a nurse, and it was an order for the nurse to administer an excessive drug dose to a patient. They asked that to 18 nurses, and 16 out of the 18 didn't go ahead with it. They disobeyed the orders from the doctor. So it shows that even though there was an authority figure there, they didn't go through that agentic state and they didn't have that agentic shift. And that also links to Milgram's experiment. So although we've got the research support from Milgram. Not all of the participants in Milgram's experiment continued, and some of them dropped out. Some of them kept questioning, some of them didn't go up to 450 volts. Because of that, Milgram's experiment doesn't suggest that every single person went through this agentic shift, which suggests that the agentic state isn't a complete explanation for obedience, and there may be other factors at play. One of the other factors at play could be legitimacy of authority. So, for someone to enter an agentic state, they have to perceive that authority figure as being legitimate. So, someone who is a legitimate authority figure, an example of this would be like a police officer or a parent, a teacher. They're authority figures that exercise social powers over others. Often they'll have something to indicate their legitimacy. So it could be the place that they are working, it could be a uniform that they have. They will have something that indicates their legitimacy. So, like in Milgram's experiment, it could be because it was done at Yale University or because the experimenter wore a lab coat. These could be indications of the legitimacy of that individual's authority. There can be some negatives of legitimacy of authority. So, some leaders may abuse their powers of authority and it could become destructive. So if you think about in Milgram's experiment, the experimenter got people to act in a cruel and dangerous way, and they were seen as the authority figure there. With regards to legitimacy of authority, we've got a couple of valuation points. So one strength of the explanation is that it can explain cultural differences. So we've got a study here from Australia and one from Germany. So the Australian one was Killam and Mann, and they found that in Australia, when they did a Milgram style experiment, only 16% of women went up to 450 volts, which suggests quite a low level of obedience. And that could be because they did not recognize that individual as a legitimate authority figure straight away or at all in the majority of cases. Whereas there was a study by Mantel in Germany, and in that study, the number was 85%, so that's significantly higher. So 85% went up to 450 volts. So this suggests that in some cultures, authority is more likely to be accepted as legitimate. But it can't explain all disobedience, and it's not a complete explanation for why people obey. For example, the NARE study, the Rankin-Jacobson one, the doctor was an obvious legitimate authority figure, and only 2 people, so only 2 out of the 18 actually obeyed and 16 didn't. So why did those 16 not? Is it something else that can explain the reasons why those 2 did and the 16 didn't? And that could be a dispositional factor. So it could actually be something to do with your personality, which could affect obedience. So when we look at agentic state and legitimacy of authority, we've got evidence to support each of these explanations, but then we've also got evidence to oppose each of these explanations, which as a whole suggests that when we're looking at explanations for obedience, it's far more complicated than just using agentic state or just using legitimacy of authority. There are other factors that could be at play. It's a very complex idea. So the next one, these other factors that could be at play could be situational variables. These situational variables could be proximity, location, or uniform. So we've got situational variables as a whole, are features of the physical and social environment which might influence someone's behavior. Examples of this are proximity, so this is the physical closeness or distance of an authority figure to the person that they're giving an order to. Location, the place where an order is issued, and uniform, so people in positions of authority often have a specific outfit which symbolizes their authority. So the uniform bit in particular and location link back to legitimacy of authority. So although this is a separate bullet point, a lot of factors in this do link back to the previous points of agentic state and legitimacy of authority. We'll start off by looking at proximity. For proximity, location, and one aspect of uniform, you need to be aware of Milgram's baseline study. So I'd get your key study sheet out for Milgram and make sure you know what the percentages were of in that baseline study of individuals that went up to 300 volts, individuals that went up to 450 volts, the number of participants in that study as well, any evaluation points from that study. So, like the idea that it's androcentric because it's all males, it's culturally biased because it's done American university white class, American males, white American males. So, yeah, make sure you're aware of Milgram's baseline study. So, proximity. In Milgram's baseline study, the teacher could hear the learner but not see him, and obedience was 65%. In the proximity variation, the teacher and learner were in the same room, and obedience fell to 40%. In the touch proximity variation, the teacher forced the learner's hand onto a shock plate, and obedience fell to 30%. In the remote instruction variation, the experimenter left the room and gave instructions to the teacher by telephone, and obedience fell to 20.5%. So you can see, as the participant is getting closer to the learner, so if they're in the same room, you don't obey as much. If you're physically putting that person's hand on the plate to shock them, you obey even less. So that shows that the closer you are to your actions, if you do not have a psychological barrier to your actions, then you're less likely to obey. And then in the remote instruction variation, obedience fell even lower. And this is because that authority figure is not in the same room. So that authority figure can't see what you are doing. So you don't have to obey because he cannot see if you are obeying or not. Okay. So with regards to proximity, the higher the level of proximity, the lower the obedience because you cannot psychologically distance yourself from your actions. Okay. So there's quite a lot of like numbers to remember in this and percentages. So I know that when you've done the lessons on this, you've seen the graph. So you might want to get the graph and highlight the graph and use the graph to help with your revision. So have like different colored bars, like one color for proximity, one color for location, and one color that links to uniform. And there's an additional study for uniform as well. And then use that graph to help you revise, especially if you're a really visual learner. We'll have a look at location. So Milgram's baseline study, it was at a prestigious university and the level of obedience was 65%. Milgram repeated this experiment in a rundown office block and found that obedience fell to 47.5%. This could be because in the baseline study, the location was Yale University, so it gave the study legitimacy and a sense of authority. So they were more likely to believe that the experimenters shared that legitimacy of authority, so they're more likely to go into the agentic state. So you see that it links back to the agentic state and legitimacy of authority there. And then finally, we've got the idea of uniform. So Milgram didn't specifically investigate uniform, but there is a little bit of a link to Milgram's study and the idea of uniform. So in his baseline study, the experimenter wore a grey lab coat as a sign of his authority. In one variation of Milgram's experiment, the experimenter was called away at the start and replaced by an ordinary member of the public who was a Confederate, and they had everyday clothing. In that situation, obedience dropped to 20%. So that individual would have lost that legitimacy of authority if they're an ordinary member of the public. There's an additional study, which is a really, really good one to use for uniform, and this is Bickman. So he specifically set out to look at the role of uniform. There were 3 Confederates dressed in different clothing. One had a jacket and tie, one had a security guard's uniform, and one was wearing a milkman's uniform. Each person would ask a passerby to pick up litter. He found that people were twice as likely to obey the security guard compared to the man in a jacket and tie. So this suggests in Bickman's study that if someone has a uniform, then you are more likely to obey that individual. And this could be because uniforms are a symbol of authority and they give that person legitimacy. So that links back to the idea of legitimacy of authority. So when you're explaining legitimacy of authority, if you wanted, you could link that to Bickman. And when you're evaluating uniform, you can use ideas from legitimacy of authority to support that. And then we've got evaluation points here. I'm just going to sort of like state a point which I've said previously for agentic state and legitimacy of authority. With regards to Milgram, all of the percentages, like when we go through proximity, and it's falling to like 40% and then 30%, never falls to zero. So there could still be something else at play because people are still obeying, even though the proximity is increased. So it's never 100% one way or the other in that research. So it's kind of like it's still not a complete explanation. So proximity, location, uniform, they're still not complete explanations of obedience. There could be a combination of factors at play. So situational variables aren't a complete explanation. It could also be dispositional variables, dispositional explanations that affect it too. And we'll have a look at those in a minute. So we've got some supporting research. So Milgram's findings have been replicated across cultures. So there was one study where they used a more realistic procedure. It was a similar Milgram style experiment, but participants were asked to say stressful things in an interview to someone to purposely make that person feel bad. And 90% of participants obeyed. But when the person given the orders was not there and they couldn't see that person during this interview process, obedience fell to 36.4%. So it suggests that that's that idea of when the authority figure isn't in the room, you're less likely to obey. So yeah, there's been similar findings to Milgram, so we can say that there's research support there. However, there could be low internal validity with the research. So participants may have been aware that the experiment was faked in this situation, so in the above research, and also in Milgram's study itself. In the Dutch study above, 14% of participants indicated that they had some doubts over the legitimacy of the procedure, and 5% were sure that it was a hoax. So it could be that people guess the aim of the experiment and then they respond to demand characteristics and they don't believe in what they're doing. They don't believe that they're really shocking someone in Milgram's experiment, or they don't believe that they're really causing someone stress in the Dutch experiment, which is the one discussed above in 1986. So yeah, there's supporting research, but there's issues with that research. So we don't yet have a complete explanation. Situational variables, they can affect obedience. We've got evidence that they do affect obedience, but we can't say that they are the complete explanation of why people obey. Final one for explanations of obedience, we've got dispositional explanations for obedience. So, a dispositional explanation is an explanation of behavior that highlights the importance of an individual's personality. And for this, the main explanation is authoritarian personality, and this is what we focus on. So, when in the exam, if they ask for a dispositional explanation, they're asking for authoritarian personality. So, authoritarian personality is a type of personality that Adorno argued was made someone susceptible to obeying somebody in authority. So, we have a few aspects of this. So, Adorno et al. Argued that people with an authoritarian personality respect authority, believe that we need strong leaders to enforce traditional values, they see others outside of their group as inferior, and they believe that things are right or wrong, so there's no in between. Everything's black and white. This type of personality develops in childhood, according to Adorno, and it's the result of harsh parenting. So, this would include strict discipline, high standards, and conditional love based on behaviour. So, that's the idea that if you behave in a particular way, then I will love you. And these experiences create hostility and resentment, which are displaced onto others who they perceive as being weaker. We have some research to support the idea of authoritarian personality, and you should have a case study sheet for this. So the research is Adorno et al., 1950. The researchers developed the F scale, which is a fascism scale, to measure authoritarian personality, and they had other personality and questionnaires that they would give individuals, and they would ask them questions about their childhood too, alongside the F scale. They interviewed or gave the questionnaire to more than 2,000 white middle-class Americans. So again, you've got cultural bias there. And you've got, so you've got cultural bias there because they're just Americans and they're white middle class. They completed the F scale alongside the other measures, and they found that people who scored higher on the F scale and other measures identified with strong people were conscious of their own status, and they showed extreme respect for those of a higher status. So if you score higher on the F scale, and it's an indication of this idea of an authoritarian personality, and you would have fixed stereotypes about other groups. He also found that with regards to the other measures, some of them had issues with their childhood and their upbringing, and their upbringings were strict. So that's where Adorno has got these features of the authoritarian personality. They come from results of the F scale study. Okay, so this idea that harsh parenting, strict discipline, respecting authority, all of these come from the F scale and the other measures that Adorno carried out in his research. In evaluation of authoritarian personality, we've got research support. So Elms and Milgram interviewed 20 people who'd participated in the original baseline experiment and had been fully obedient. So they went all the way up to the top shock level. They completed the F scale and other measures, and these participants scored higher on the F scale than a comparison group of disobedient participants, so those who did not go all the way up to 450 volts. However, although they found a link between a high score on the F scale and the level of obedience in Milgram's baseline study, they didn't find a link between authoritarian personality and childhood experience. There's no way of explaining why someone would develop this personality because there wasn't a link in Elms and Milgram's study. Also, it's a limited explanation for a reason of obedience. It cannot explain obedience for the majority of a country's population because not everyone would have this authoritarian personality. An alternative explanation would be social identity theory approach. So this is the idea that you would identify with an in-group and scapegoat an out-group, and that in-group would tend to be like the majority group within a population. So like social identity theory approach is probably a better explanation for what happened in Germany during World War II. People would identify as the majority in group and they would scapegoat those out groups, and that's why that behavior would occur, and that would explain why the majority of a population would behave in a particular way. Whereas authoritarian personality, you can't explain that because the majority of the population would not have an authoritarian personality. It would often tend to be a minority of a population that would have this extremely sort of like fascist, have these fascist features that are found on the F scale. Okay, so We've had a look at the first bullet point from the advanced information, which is explanations for obedience. Feel free to go back and pause this at certain points, write down some notes, complete the worksheet alongside it. And once you've done that, have a look at the next bullet point. So I'll put that in a separate video and I'll put that up as part 2.